5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thunderbirds are go!
Something's wrong, Mr. Tracy.
The moment it comes closer, pow!
There's a helpless man aboard Thunderbird 3.
Thunderbird 1 is the only thing fast enough to intercept, Father. What's his course, Brains?
There's nothing in the world we can do to stop him now.
Thunderbirds, Flight to Destruction, read by Andrew Clements.
Boy, am I glad to be handing over to you. John Tracy slapped his brother Alan on the shoulder and grinned. 1 month up here sure is enough. The two men stood by the access ramp of International Rescue Space Satellite orbiting far above the Earth. Outside, the huge bulk of Thunderbird 3 lay locked in the communication position, waiting to take John back home after his routine spell of lonesome duty. A final wave of his hand, and he walked through the automatic locks into the control cabin of Thunderbird 3. His hands sped over the controls with the ease of long practice, and the initial motors drew the massive craft slowly out of contact with the satellite. At once, John opened the long-range communication with the tropical island base, where his father and the rest were waiting, and read over his atmosphere re-entry course. Then, at full boost, the space cruiser began its long haul home. There were many sounds in Thunderbird 3 to break into John's thoughts on such a flight. Radio atmospherics, the ticking of the sensitive instruments of the control panel, but there was one sound more than usual, too low to be noticed over the rest. Low, like the first hiss a snake makes before a strike at an unsuspecting victim, the deadly sigh of escaping gas. Pentamonia thianol, Brains had called it, a supercoolant designed to operate Thunderbird 3's temperature control system. A gas to be handled with care, for its effect, though not fatal, would send a man to sleep for hours. And now it was escaping, spurt by spurt, into the control cabin where John was sitting. Odorless, colorless gas. Minutes ticked by as the spaceship sped on its way towards Earth. When John Tracy felt his eyelids beginning to droop, he shook his head wonderingly, stood up in his seat, and half-turned. Then he opened his mouth to speak, but only a croak came out, and he pitched sideways to the cabin floor. Thunderbird 3 plunged on helplessly. They were taking things easy at International Rescue Headquarters. Brains, as usual, was deep in a scientific textbook, content to sit at the poolside and watch the others swim. Jeff Tracy sat beside him, listening to a transistor radio and glancing across from time to time, amazed that the scientist could shut out the music and the half-hourly urgency of the newscasts.
Here is your 12 noon time check,
said the radio. And at that, Brains looked up. Gee, is that the time already, Mr. Tracy?
That's what the man said,
replied Jeff, smiling.
Why, Brains? Feeling like some lunch?
No, Mr. Tracy, but John should have checked in a routine course change at 11:45. Jeff frowned.
Why, that's right, Brains. Let's go see what kept him.
The two men walked into the innocent-looking lounge, and Jeff pressed a hidden switch. At once, the inkstand on his desk tilted to reveal a microphone, and he selected John's call signal.
International rescue to Thunderbird 3. Come in, Thunderbird 3.
There was no answer. The portrait of John on the wall that should have clicked to a telescanner screen remained immobile. "Something's wrong, Mr. Tracy. I'll stand by the emergency link right away."
Good grief.
Jeff Tracy was on his feet now, his knuckles white on the edge of his desk.
What's his course, Brains?
"That's just it, Mr. Tracy. Something must have happened to him before he could make the change. The way he's going, he'll come through the atmosphere heading straight for New York, and his controls are set on manual. If Jodrell 6 wasn't dismantled for overhaul, we could guide John in, but there's nothing in the world we can do to stop him now." Still wet from the pool, Gordon, Scott, and Virgil faced their father across the lounge.
"We've got to do something, Father."
It was Virgil who spoke.
"There's got to be an answer."
Jeff Tracy shook his head, his eyes screwed shut in desperate thought, his fists clenched.
"But what? What? Think of 1,000 impossible rescues, and our organization can tackle them all. But this one? Thunderbird 1 is the only thing fast enough to intercept, Father," said Scott Tracy. "Let me take her up and see what I can do."
It's not a spacecraft, Scott," broke in Brains. "Whatever you attempt, it'll have to be within Earth's atmosphere."
"Whatever I attempt? Heck, is there anything I can attempt? But sitting here won't solve it."
His father nodded despairingly, and Scott made for the swiveling door that led to Thunderbird 1's entry system.
"For Pete's sake, think! Think! Think!" he yelled as the door swung round. "Keep the radio open all the time."
Within moments, the slender Thunderbird 1 was resting on its launch pad. Smoke and flame shot from its tail as it lifted off on its impossible mission.
"Changing to horizontal flight," said Scott. "I'm beamed onto John's course. Estimated time of convergence, 1 hour."
A small video screen deep in the top security building at New York, the home of the world government's Central Attack Early Warning Control, glowed brightly. On it, caught by ultra-long-range radio bounce, the image of Thunderbird 3, head-on and homing fast. General Omar K. Matheson straightened slowly, his jaw set in a hard line. The staff major at his side looked at him questioningly.
"It's one of the ships that International Rescue uses," muttered the general. "Get on the link right away and find out what they're playing at."
The major did as he was told, and hurried back faster than he'd ever moved before.
"It's a runaway, sir. They claim to have an interceptor in flight now, but they report there's no definite plan of diversion." "No definite plan?"
The general's eyes blazed, and points of red stood out on his cheeks.
"Let me talk to them!"
Seconds later, General Matheson was speaking directly to Alan Tracy in the space satellite. He didn't mince his words.
"You listen here, feller. There are millions of people in this city, and if your ship takes its dive here, there's gonna be a cartload of big-time bombs going off."
"It's in hand, General." Alan tried to sound reassuring, but he knew as well as Scott that the chances of doing anything were slim.
"It'd better be in hand,"
spat the general.
"I'm alerting missiles. You get that? I'm giving your ship a ceiling boundary of 4 miles, and the moment it comes closer, pow!"
"You can't do that, General. There's a helpless man aboard Thunderbird 3. The general was unimpressed.
"There are millions of helpless people in New York. One man's life against a million. Which way would you jump, buddy?"
At the controls of Thunderbird 1, Scott Tracy took General Matheson's ultimatum with gritted teeth. Supposing he failed, he'd have a grandstand view to watch his own brother blown to bits. Scott forced himself to push those thoughts to the back of his mind. He spoke coolly into the radio. 152,000 feet, and still climbing. Before I can do a thing, I'll have to get even higher." Suddenly, he gave an excited yell. "I can see it! I can see Thunderbird 3! There it was, a distant speck against the vast sky, hurtling downwards like some crazy comet. Now Brains came over the air, speaking urgently. "Remember, Scott, she's still on manual control. That means John will not have retracted the flight vanes."
"I follow, Brains. So they'll slow her down a little. But won't they burn off?"
The scientist stuttered a protest. "No, The metal I used is utterly resistant.
Then I'm gonna get as high as I possibly can, make a hairpin turn, and follow her down, said Scott. I only hope this ship will take it. On converging courses, the two Thunderbirds were much closer now, and Scott could make out every detail of Thunderbird 3 as he flung his own craft into a tight turn that threatened to black him out. He heard his own voice repeating, I must hold on. I must hold on. Now the huge, blasting bulk of Thunderbird 3 passed him, dwarfing her sister ship so that Scott groaned aloud. What can I do? What can I do? I can't get beneath her and carry her off. She's too big. There was silence from the radio. In the headquarters lounge, Jeff exchanged hopeless glances with the others. This was what they had feared all along, what they'd known, though they wouldn't admit it until the crunch came. Scott was behind Thunderbird 3, and the craft was tossed like a toy in the backwash of the spaceship's rockets. And then it came, the sudden flash of inspiration that might work, the mad, ridiculous plan that only a fool or a desperate man would try. I'm going to shoot out her motors, Scott yelled into the radio. Brains was quick off the mark.
Stop, Scott. It wouldn't do any good. You must realize the impetus of Thunderbird 3 would carry her onto the target regardless.
Just a minute, Brains, shouted Scott. You don't know the rest of it yet. Carefully, Scott sighted the emergency missile carried in Thunderbird 1 and placed his thumb on the firing button. If he missed, it could be the end of his brother. He held his breath and jabbed, and the missile streaked away to slam unerringly into the main motors of the runaway spaceship. At once, the slipstream buffeting stopped, and Scott relaxed his hands on the controls of Thunderbird 1. Part 1 of the plan successful, he yelled. Now for the real works.
What the heck are you up to?
Jeff Tracy's voice crackled over the radio. But Scott didn't answer. His scheme was too far out, 2 million to 1. Deliberately, he increased the speed of his ship and pointed the sharp nose straight for the dead motors of Thunderbird 3. His hand slammed down on the full boost lever, and instantly he curled forward in his seat, his hands protecting his head as Thunderbird 1 launched itself to collision. The shattering impact flung him head over heels, across the control panel, against the screen, back over and under his seat. But miraculously, he was unhurt. There was too much at stake to pass out now. The nose of Thunderbird 1 had struck and lodged, buried deep within the shattered motors of Thunderbird 3. Now the two ships, a single united vehicle, sped on the same course downwards. I've done it! I've done it! Scott couldn't help practically crowing the news to base. If only Thunderbird 1's strong enough to steer the spaceship, we're saved. Again, there was silence from the radio, but this time it was for a different reason. Messages were coming through rapidly on the land link, and they were coming through from General Omar K. Matheson.
You'd better steer hard and steer fast, Scott.
Jeff's voice was as edgy as ice.
You're approaching the 4-mile limit Matheson set, and he's not gonna give way an inch. If you can't swing yourself wide, those missiles are gonna be on their way.
Scott hardly dared answer. Sweat stood out on his brow as he wrestled with the controls that suddenly wouldn't respond. It doesn't seem to have worked out, Father, he groaned. The spaceship's just too big. I can't get any movement at all.
Stay with it, son. Stay with it.
Now Jeff's voice was harsh.
Keep trying. Somehow you've got to move Thunderbird 3 or it will be curtains for you both.
Suddenly the tips of Scott's clenched fingers transmitted tiny vibrations up through his taut forearms, up through his straining muscles. Hey, we're shifting! By golly, we're shifting! Slowly but surely the combined bulk of the two ships began to respond. Gradually, painfully, the image of the American continent below began to swing round on its axis. And then, far below, Scott saw twin trails like white pencil lines drifting up towards him, and his blood froze. Father! His hands were suddenly clammy on the controls. New York have fired their missiles! Deadly nuclear-tipped little rockets sped upwards on their course of destruction. 2 needles of death, launched by reluctant men, heavy-hearted men, but men of determination. Above them, their target lurched and staggered across the sky, piloted by an equally determined man. "It's like trying to steer a car with 4 wheels all of different sizes, and one of them square," said Scott into the radio. He'd read somewhere that men grow flippant and that they make jokes when they're staring death in the eye. Now he knew it was true. The missiles had become things of detached interest, to be watched, studied. Perhaps he'd try and read the code letters on the warheads in the moment before they struck home. And then he realized they wouldn't strike home. The courses were so different. He could tell they'd missed by a mile. So odd, but he almost felt disappointed. Scott shook himself out of his strange mood and watched the twin trails climb past him and go streaking out towards space. Then he looked below and saw the sea, and a fleeting glimpse of the west coast of America. So that was the Pacific Ocean. Like a man in a dream, and tired like a man who should be in a dream, he called base. "International rescue from Thunderbird 1. You'd better get Virgil to bring out Thunderbird 2, selecting Pod 4. You'll need equipment for marine recovery and marine rescue, 'cause me and John, we're going down into the sea, and going down very soon." Fluttering from side to side like a stricken bird, the bonded mass of the 2 rescue vehicles kicked spray from the surface of the Pacific, bounced half a dozen times like a skimmed stone, and sank in 10 fathoms off Moratoa Atoll. The pool at International Rescue's island headquarters was full as usual. There was an impromptu game of water polo going on, and Scott, Virgil and Gordon were playing Tintin, Brains and John. John was fully recovered. Only Brains complained of trouble. "How can I see the ball without my glasses, fellas?" And then Jeff Tracy came out to the poolside, and his grinning face made them all swim in and listen. Could it be a call for help? "We've had a special request," said Jeff, "from a general who, shall be nameless. It seems there are a couple of very expensive missiles orbiting around uselessly in space, with their jets burnt out, and he wants to know if we'd consider going out to bring them back."